The problem is that there is a fundamental issue which has to be addressed. That for the first time in our fiscal management, our government is running deficits on its current account in excess of $250 million. Now what does that mean? Capital expenditure is normally regarded as discretionary. A government will plan for estimates, decide the level of fiscal deficit that it needs, cover its wages and salaries and all the other expenses on the current account side, and then make a determination as to how much fiscal deficit it can incur over the given year. In this environment, there is no such space for the government because the government is running deficits, unusually so, on the current account of the magnitude of $250 million. Put simply, if you were a household and you were borrowing money to pay your utilities and your rent, it would tell you, if you were borrowing money to pay your utilities and your rent, that's a serious ring, man. It means that you will be in absolute trouble. This government is in that kind of difficulty. How did we get there? If you take up any of the documents of the government, if you take up the central bank reports, you would recognize that a major part of the reason is that the transfers and subsidies of government have grown substantially. That was not by accident. That was a deliberate strategy to employ persons through the back door at Transport Board, the Water Authority, and other statutory corporations. Now, this government is now in no position to correct that situation within less than a 5-year period. So the capacity to recover from the current recession has nothing to do, to my mind, or less to do with the international environment than it has to do with correcting domestic policy. The domestic policy is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. Therein lies the major challenge for us as a country. Typically in Barbados, from the 1960s, if you were to check, there's a pattern of behavior of governments. They tend to spend more prior to an election. What has happened to us is that we spent more post-election because we promised that the previous administration was doing everything wrong and that everything will be corrected, and there was an attempt to subtly do it, but that has caused severe difficulties in our economy. Now, for me, and I'll say this now that I have the mic, the only way in which we can recover is if we legislate some of the fiscal principles which I will now enunciate. The first thing is that we are required every year to bring the estimates of the appropriation bill to Parliament. It has to be done in time to make payment and spending legal by the 1st of April. The second thing is that there is something called the Ways and Means, or the overdraft facility of the central bank, which is that at the start of a given fiscal year, the government's borrowing from the central bank is limited to 10% of the estimated revenue for a given fiscal year. That simply means that their capacity to use the overdraft is set by a legislative requirement. Given best practice, Barbados has to do some of the following. There's no other way. We are so bad in terms of our fiscal position that unless we legislate the need to run surpluses on a current account, we're not going to get out of this current fiscal crisis which we're in. The other thing which we need to do is that the last administration corrected the national insurance scheme and focused on borrowing from local sources rather than international sources. Within the last 2 years, we have increased the local lending limit by in excess of $1 billion. So how do you get yourself out of this situation if you continue to spend the way that government has been spending and has paid little or no attention to the overall management of our fiscal affairs? No. There is no limit, or this government has increased that limit substantially within the last 2 years. The other thing that will have to be done is that there will have to be a stated policy of putting in legislation the ratio, the relationship between local and foreign borrowing. And if we don't do it, we're going to be compromising our very future. So let me end by saying that we have made mistakes. But you cannot confine mistakes to the last 2 years. If you're going to be truthful, you have to look over a much longer time period to see what we have done in terms of best practice and learn from those best practices. But what we have sadly done in the last 2 years is that we have ignored all of the fundamental fiscal principles which we learned over the last 40 years. And that's why I'm saying to you that this recession has persisted so far longer than any other recession. But we are uncertain as to when we can recover because the government is not in a position to do much about the recession given what it did immediately after acquiring or becoming the government. Our finances are so bad that it is almost impossible for us to reverse the situation within less than 5 years. Now, all that I've said, in essence, can be captured in this document, which is a government document. So this is not Clyde Mascoll, the politician, speaking. This is Clyde Mascoll, the economist, speaking. And that's maybe part of the difficulty with getting involved in the political arena, because every time you put a view in the public domain, there's a hint of politics. The reality is that we have been poorly managed, and it continues in the last 2.5 years as far as I'm concerned. It happens to coincide with a change in government. But more fundamentally, it happens to coincide with a government that has not yet enunciated a philosophy or a fiscal policy to carry this country forward. Thank you. There's lots more to say.